Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design.
Hey, Mike. So we're doing the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast a little bit differently this time because we're actually in the same room.
Same room. Here we go.
We're in Washington, D.C. for Education Week's Leaders to Learn From Symposium. So we did a few breakouts. And as exciting as it is to be in D.C. and be presenting with you and stuff, we have a pretty awesome guest today.
Unbelievable. Yes, we have John Hattie joining us for a conversation about learning. He really talked about, I would challenge you, Michael. Could we talk about the theory of teaching? I bet you could come up with answers. But what would you say if I challenged you to the question, what is your theory of learning?
Yeah, and I feel like I always have John in the back of my head, and you know why? Because, you get these opportunities to talk to him as well. And he just, what I like about John is that I think if people only knew the research, they would be missing out on a whole lot as well. And what I really enjoy is that, besides the academic piece, and we were able to ask him, and can't wait for all of you to hear him. We've talked about, what did you learn? What have you learned over this time? So that was a pretty great conversation, but it's also just the personal stuff, something you can relate to because he, babysits his grandson on Mondays. And so having people see that side of him, I think is equally as important.
Yes, he was very human in this interview, and just wants to continue to do really good work and support learning.
Yeah, so we hope you enjoy this conversation with John Hattie about all things learning.
Did you know Corwin provides Visible Learning Plus workshops led by some of the biggest thought leaders in education? Discover strategies from John Hattie, Fisher and Fry, and more as they share evidence-based solutions for immediate impact in your classroom. Get started at corwin.com today.
John Hattie, welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
It's great to be with you, Pete and Mike.
Thank you.
It's good to see you. So what have you been up to? Because I think we could start with a load of questions about research and practice and everything else, but I think that just by you telling us what you've been up to, because you've been on a whirlwind tour, we can find a lot of questions just in that alone.
Sure. Well, what I've been up to is, I'm retired from my university job, so I have whole days that I can get and do things and be naughty. And every Monday is my highlight because I babysit my grandson, who's a 3-year-old, and we're really into cars. And I introduced him last week to Lamborghinis, and he loves his new Guinea. It's a very tiny one. And we go to the park and we do all the kind of things that you can do. So that's the highlight. But I'm also I'm the house husband for Janet, supporting her because she's still working. And I destroy trees, lots of still writing. And as you hinted last week, I had one of those tours where I had a day in Munich where we launched the German version of the Visible Learning sequel with Klaus Zara. And then I flew to Stockholm and did a session up there with Gordon Pode from Denmark, and then flew back to Singapore, where we are working with ironically, the German schools, quite a lot of them in Singapore, implementing visible learning. And so I met with the team there. I visited some classrooms, which is always a highlight to actually talk to students and hear that language of learning, and then come back again. And so that's kind of what I do most days.
That's great. That's quite the whirlwind tour.
That is an incredible whirlwind tour. My question comes a little bit tied to that, but a little bit personal as well. So, John, I think you might know because we've had a dinner together and things, but I was a superintendent in the school district that raised me. So my Italian ancestors settled, grandparents settled in Enumclaw. My parents were raised in Enumclaw, Washington, in the state of Washington. And that's where I became superintendent. And this guy next to me has all of a sudden opened the world to me a bit differently in education. So you started as a band teacher. Am I correct on that?
Music teacher, yes.
Music teacher.
The concept of band doesn't exist in New Zealand, but yes.
So all of a sudden, I even as an old guy, I'm seeing the world of education open up and literally using the world, the word world in that phrase. Your research has just transformed so many people across the world. When did you realize that? How did you feel about that? How do you continue to feel about that? Because I think our listeners would really want to know, because you're so kind to introduce us to your grandchild and stories about your grandchild. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, working backwards, I now have 6.5 grandkids, and they are the highlight of the life. But one of the things that struck me a while ago was someone asked me a question kind of similar to that. So I did a little background research on it. And in the year 1900, when you ask what percentage of the world was literate and numerate, it was 16%, 14%, 14 to 16%, tiny. And when you ask in the year 2000, what percentage of the world was literate and numerate, it's 86%. And if you think of that, someone writing the history of the 20th century, surely that is the most incredible finding ever, that the world transformed in 100 years from 14% illiterate to 14% illiterate in 100 years. Now, in that 14% illiterate, it's a huge number, absolutely. But I just think it's phenomenal. And quite often with an audience, I ask the audience, what possible reasons? And the normal reasons are, the spread of communication, the textbooks, the spread of schooling, the funding. And I believe it's none of those, Mike. It's simple. It's teachers. And so your point is that we underestimate that incredible power that teachers have. We all talk about our own school. We can think of those incredible teachers we had ourselves, and the modal number of those is usually around 2 out of the 50 we had, which is not good enough. And then when you look at what you're saying in this century, in the year 2000, I don't think, Mark, and I'll ask you this, I don't think then principals looked at research. It was something that happened in the university. It was separate. And you had your evidence, which was your experience, vast as it can be and deep as it can be, but you didn't look at research. Whereas today, it would be very hard to find many principals who weren't aware of the research. They don't have to agree with that, and that's never the point, but it's there and it's part of the story. So, Peter, year 2000, where were you?
I was in elementary school. No, I'm just no, I was actually teaching first grade in the year 2000. So it was about 6 years before I became a school principal, actually.
What about you, Mike?
I was an assistant superintendent in the school district that raised me. So I was on my way to being
You're
superintendent.
assistant superintendent. So if you can think back then, did you look up the research at that point?
We had a transformative event happen. It's when the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation focused on education, and they offered 8 district grants in the United States. And Enumclaw was one of 8 districts chosen for that district grant. And that transformed, you were right, right at that time period, that transformed how we looked at data differently and what we were exposed to. Right or wrong, whether you agree with the foundation's work or not, it was transformational for me. So that does parallel that same timeline.
And so in many senses, I've been very fortunate coming along at a time and doing the work that I've been doing. And as you two know, that it wasn't part of my academic mission at all. It was a side thing. And I actually wrote the 2008 book to get it out of my system, not thinking it would be the opposite. And so in a sense, it was a nice zeitgeist I got into at that moment. And there's many others, obviously, that have been trying to find ways to tell a story about the data that makes it more accessible. And I think that's what I've been trying to do. And I could name quite a few others that have been doing that as well. And so in that sense, it was great. And so I could spend my whole life as an academic and no one would care. The fact that people do is an incredible honor, very humbling and terrifying.
Mm.
It's terrifying because of the other part of my life is when I was a graduate student in Otago, New Zealand. I had the fortune of going to sessions run by Karl Popper, who's a very famous philosopher, probably one of the most, if not the most famous philosopher of science. And he argued, his argument is that science progresses by asking, what evidence would you accept you're wrong?
Mm.
And that's driven me. And like, as superintendents, classroom teachers, and I do this in my own life, I look for evidence I'm right. And it's very comforting, it's good. And I teach a class and 3 students understood it all. So I say, see, I can do it. It's just the other students are not very smart. That's not a very healthy way of doing it.
Yeah.
And so that way of thinking, that mind frame of looking for evidence you're wrong is the same in schools as it is in the pursuit of science. And so I go a step further. What drives me is my terror that I'm wrong. And this is one of the reasons I keep adding meta-analyses. And like even since the 2023 sequel, I've added about another 200, 300 meta-analyses. And every time I open one, it's like, oh my goodness, what if this one shows that the story is wrong? And sometimes I have had to modify the story. Fortunately, nothing dramatic, because as you know, I'm trying to get to the big picture and then come down. But someday it will happen, the world will change, and I'm looking forward to someone out there who can take all the data I have, and as you know, I've given it away free, it's on the web, anyone can access it, to come up with a better story. And I'll be the first to congratulate them, and that's how we continue. So in a long-winded way of saying it, it's very humbling when you go around and see the work being used. It's wonderful to know that that can happen. I do welcome the critics. I had a critic in the audience in Sweden, and I have to say he was one of those critics who knew the work incredibly well, knew how to criticize, and he knew how to criticize without making it personal.
Mhm.
And so we're following up, and we've actually had followed up before. I hadn't realized that we'd emailed each other before. And that's what keeps me going. And working, Peter, with you, you constantly are asking about how does this fit in? Where does this fit in? And it's challenging. And that's the beauty of it. And so, yes, it's really nice that fact that someone cares. It's really nice that I have access, but it is terrifying.
John, you reminded me when you were talking about your whirlwind trip last week. I still remember the first one I went on with you, which was London, Denmark, and Sweden. And we were, 5 days or 6 days, and it was a whirlwind for sure. And I remember being in Denmark with you and sitting in a room with 6 of the leading researchers in Denmark. And for 2 hours, they just fired questions at you.
Well, they
And
had
you
their
answered
mind
them
sharpened
all.
too.
But I do. I remember that's when I started to have even deeper respect for you, because when you were in that room, you were getting these questions and you said, oh, I haven't thought about that. And you were answering that way. It was never a defensive thing. It was never a no, I'm a right. It was always about, oh, I need to be able to look at this in a different way and that kind of stuff. And I think to me, that's a very powerful memory of being with you during that time. Mike and I are in DC right now because we've been at the EdWeek Leaders to Learn From Symposium. You spoke here before COVID, and I was with you. And so there are topics that are coming up, right? Like teacher attrition, and there are things like professional learning. And the benefit, I think, too, of your work has been every time somebody brings up a topic like teacher attrition and professional learning, I think about the research you've introduced me to because of that. My question is, you did this tour last week, you were in Germany, and then you went to Singapore and you were working with German schools. What are things that are resonating for educators in different parts of the world that are coming up? That's the fun part about facilitating, right? Because these topics, these common themes will come up. So are there any common themes that are coming up right now that are resonating for educators that they're either concerned about or they want to learn more about, that they're asking you about?
Yeah, and you hit it on the head there, Peter. Like the one post-COVID is attrition.
Mm.
Teacher supply, it's become a huge issue. And it kind of comes back to the previous question. My fascination is getting the right questions on the table. And as you know, I've been saying for years, what works is the wrong question. It's what works best, and so on. And attrition is another one. And I've pondered over this because over the last 9-10 years, I've also had a government role here in Australia as the chair of a government institute that oversees this issue. And I'm just fascinated why today, post-COVID, we have all this debate about attrition, about burnout, about workload, when if you actually look at the evidence, and I've pored over this stuff, it's not that much different to what it was pre-COVID, but we never had that debate. And I actually wrote a bloggy kind of thing last year here in Australia and put it on the Australian Council of Educational Leaders workshop site, and it had a lot of good interaction about it. And it still beguiles me why that happens. And I'm just worried, like we're spending billions here in Australia trying to solve the problem. We've had major reports, and I don't even think we got close to the right question. Like you look at burnout among principals, which you two have been. I put it the opposite and say, principals deal with a lot of stuff. Sometimes it's not pleasant. Sometimes, kids can be naughty kids, extremely naughty kids. And there's violence, which is interesting because violence is a tricky term. Like here in Australia, if you walk out of a class and say that lesson was horrible, that's violence, and that's counted, as opposed to hitting someone, which is unacceptable. But here's my argument. I think principals are stunningly good at coping strategies with those kind of incidents, and we should be esteeming them. But the profession is now turning it on its head and shooting itself in the foot and saying, don't become a principal. It's violent and you'll be burnt out and you'll workload and you'll die and all these kind of horrible things. Whereas in fact, if you ask principals, and PISA has, 90% plus say it's a wonderful job, they enjoy doing it, and they'd recommend it to others. But that's not the current climate. Then you look at teachers, and here's my best explanation at the moment. It's an explanation without a lot of data, so someone might have the data for this, is that problem isn't workload. And as you know, Peter, and you've done this work, trying to get teachers to de-implement is incredibly difficult. And you've written a whole book on this. And if you give a teacher and take 10 things off them, you can be guaranteed they'll add another 20. It's not a workload problem. I think it's a relentlessness problem. That as you're a teacher and a principal, it's relentless. You're constantly on the job. You're constantly being asked. You've got to, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing because I think we as a profession like it. But think what happened during COVID. We could, during the day, put the washing on, take the dog for a walk, have a cup of coffee. We had moments where the students did the work, not us. And we're one of the few professions that came back full time to the classroom. And I think the message is, we don't want that. And so one of the things I've been doing, and we're close to here in one of the states in Australia, is arguing that teachers should have a 4-day week. We should solve the relentlessness problem, not the workload problem. Because in solving the workload problem, I think we have nothing. Now, where I'm at in this, you two, is I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I know the right answer is not solving the workload problem. It's the relentlessness problem. Of course they overlap. But what we've been doing, like here in Australia for the last 20 years, the average student population has increased about 1%. The teacher population has increased 2 or 3%, and the non-teacher adults has increased 400%. Every time we throw more adults in the school, that's actually more work for the teachers. And so some of our solutions have exacerbated the problem. So my big answer to your question is every country I've been in the last couple of years, this is a problem. And teachers are saying, hey, it's relentless. I want to add one more and then I'll shut up. It's staying in the classroom. Like I look here in Australia, we have a very high starting salary for teachers. It's the 5th highest graduate starting salary. But after 7 years, you reach the max. And after that, it's consumer price index. There is no incentive to stay in the classroom as a teacher. There is no way that you're recognized as an excellent teacher. You're just a teacher, and there's nothing wrong with that. One state, 40% of its teachers are now middle leaders. Do we really need 40% middle? It's the only way to pay them more. And so one of the things that I've been trying to argue, and we almost got there in one of the states, is to say, we need some ways of saying that we got, for instance, in one state, they were prepared to pay the highly accomplished and lead teacher, which is kind of like national board teachers, as much as a principal. It didn't go down well with some principals, but they were prepared to do it. And I think that's another thing we have to look at. It's not performance pay, because we know from the meta-analyses that has an effect size of 0.04. It is trying to recognize, like every other profession, that we have expertise. And I would love and ask the profession to stand up and acknowledge that we have some stunningly excellent teachers, and that's what should drive us. But that's not our current rhetoric. And I deeply worry that our current rhetoric is going to actually work against us. A long answer, but my argument is that as I go around each country, it is a problem. And I really do hope as a profession, and through your podcast and through anyone listening on it, that we ask, what's the right problem we're solving here?
Mhm. It the whole thing about the rhetoric, in the United States alone, there's been negative rhetoric around education for many years, decades actually. And it's funny because you mentioned de-implementation. Last night I was given a keynote on de-implementation here in DC. And one of the things that I said is, because I used Mentimeter and it was all anonymous and it's an online engagement tool. And I asked, I want you to think about something you control right now in this moment. I don't want you to think about things you don't control. I want you to think about something you control that you would de-implement. And the very first thing that came up is, I don't like some of the state laws about, and I mentioned something, and I said, that is not something you control, right? And it's just really interesting to watch because two people you know very well, Helen Timperley and Vivienne Robinson, back in 2000, said that teachers contribute to their own workload more than any school initiative does, because we have addition sickness and we just need to add it on top of everything else. And part of what I think is really interesting too about your research, and you were saying this when Mike and I were with you in Kansas last year, you were talking about professional learning. And in the 1980s and 1990s, when you're looking at professional learning, the effect size was fairly high because the researchers are actually looking at whether the professional learning was having an impact on teachers changing the strategy. But they changed the question in 2000 until now and started to focus on whether that professional learning was actually having an impact on student learning and the effect size.
Mainly Helen Timperley's work that turned that around.
Yeah, so it's really, some of those nuances I think are really interesting too, that I wonder if, how do you, because your research is massive and we often have a common language, but we don't have a common understanding. How have you had to clarify your work over the years?
Look, that's the endless game. Like, as Aristotle, nothing new under the sun. Sometimes all I do is try and come up with a package of language that helps better understand it. And so it's kind of like that old story that the day you go home as an academic and say, oh my gosh, I'm a fraud, you're a true academic, that what you're doing is repackaging. And that's primarily what I do, is say, what is the language, the meta language that gets it, that avoids what you've said? Because yes, like I know that the critique I get, quite a bit of it is because I haven't been as clear about the language. Like the class size, which upsets a lot of people. I should have been stronger in the earlier day and saying, 0.13 effect size is a positive effect size. Therefore, reducing class size does increase achievement. That's what a positive means. What I was pondering was, why was it so small? But that got misunderstood. And so, yes, I have tried to continually listen to my critics and come up with better language. And one of the main things I've tried to do in the sequel is spend a lot more time on the story and get the story right. Whereas in the 2008, I had more data to create a story. Now I have a story and trying to get that across. And one of the reasons I continue to cut down trees and write is to keep clarifying that story. And I enjoy doing that. But you're right, it is very much about that. And it's like going back to your de-implementation. If you look at, like what I love to see, and there's hardly any, is time and motion studies on teachers, because the few that have been done, mainly actually on principals, is less than 5 or 10% of their workload is related to anything from the state mandate. It's all to do with what they create in their own school. And there was a great study done here in Australia a few years ago where they came up with a list of about 200 things and said, do you want to be able to do this or not? And the variation in the answers were dramatic. And by law, every single one of them, a principal could do or not do. And so there's a massive, and it's the same out there as what language, but it comes back to what we do as academics, but it's also what happens in schools. Like, Mike, you created a language as a superintendent, which expressed your priorities, which expressed what you wanted to see happen. And I bet in some of your schools that was misinterpreted. It was seen as a mandate. It was seen as something different. It's not what we do here. But that's the same as principals. Like the biggest power a principal has is they create the language in their school. And if that language is about tests and curriculum and following the state mandate, the school down the road, it's about learning and the joy of discovery. It's the same system. And so one of the things I think we all need to realize is we need to sometimes have a sit back and listen to how others are interpreting our language in the class. Like the PISA study, which always shocks me, of 30 million kids, 40% of the world's kids believe that the teacher doesn't care about their learning. Now, I don't think most teachers in the world would agree with that. And I think that's wonderful. But that doesn't deny what the kids think. 40% of the kids think that this teacher doesn't continue to teach me to learn, they just move on. And I think that our students misunderstand our language, our teachers misunderstand the school language, our school language misunderstands the system. And you know the system is up here, it deals with these things, it's appealing more to the politicians and the public. So no wonder their language gets misinterpreted. And I could, like you, could spend a lot of time querying why on earth they do what they do, which doesn't do anything that's destructive. But I do think that what I do is what we should be doing is coming up with a better language, and we should be asking all the time, what evidence would we accept or wrong?
I keep going back to, I'm sitting here listening, and for superintendents maybe that are listening to this podcast, the word workload, and like Peter said, we're here in Washington, D.C., and we heard researchers yesterday say that workload is up there for teachers to say is a huge issue. Professional learning or professional development is very low, if not zero, for a teacher's needs, but it's high for a principal's needs. And this not congruent. And I guess I was really playing with the concept of, in a system, if you've defined professional learning, what professional learning really is and what the engagement is, and there's joy in the project in which you're doing or the initiative in which you're leading, all of a sudden you don't feel like it's work. It's the pure essence of things. And so that's what you've made me kind of has resonated.
We have a paper coming out soon. One of my final PhD students did a meta-analysis, a huge study on attrition from schools and from the system. And the bottom line is very simple. Teachers stay because of students and they leave because of leaders. There's nothing in there. They leave because of systems. And then professional learning, like, again, Peter, you've written on this extensively, and we've done this all the time, is the mistake we make is clumping it and saying professional learning. And we know, like almost everything in our business, there's massive variation. And the secret is what parts of professional learning work. So it disappoints me when people get up and say, oh, professional learning doesn't work. And at the same time, they say, oh, but it's compulsory for kids to go to school and get professional learning.
Yeah.
It's kind of inconsistent. And asking what professional learning works, like what are the highest influences in the whole work? It is teachers having the time to work together to question their impact. That whole notion of collective efficacy. And that requires time and resources. And I'm arguing strongly, as you have been, Peter, that needs to be done in the school time, not as an extra. But I just find it remarkable that anyone can get up and talk about professional learning not working without saying what aspect of it doesn't. And there are aspects doesn't work.
Right.
We know that. There are aspects that do work. It's like saying schools don't work. For some kids, it does. For some teachers, that variance is the essence of our business. So, like you, Mike, I get angry and frustrated with those generic calls. Of course, if you look at the total budget that goes to schools in America, percentage that's spent on professional learning is less than 1%.
Correct.
And they want to get rid of it. I want to triple it on the right stuff.
Yeah, the relevance piece definitely comes up. Okay, John, we have one more question for you. This whole season has been focusing on the learner's mindset, because to me, you are one of, my biggest influences when it comes to the love of learning and just trying to figure out what the real language is, and, common language, common understanding, research, all of that stuff. What have you learned over the years doing the work that you're doing?
Well, actually, that's the subject of the book we've just finished this last couple of weeks. I'm writing it with my son and a couple of others on that very, very question. And I won't put you on the spot here, Mike, but I reckon that if I asked you, what is your theory of teaching, you would probably spend 2 or 3 hours telling me, and it would be a joy to listen to. But then when I said to you, Mike, tell me now about your theory of learning, I think there'd be a lot more silence. And one of my campaigns is, how do we get educators to have a theory of learning? And wouldn't it be nice if it was aligned with the theory of teaching?
Yeah.
I have news for you. Your students don't care much at all about how you teach. They know that every time they hit a teacher, it's going to be different.
Yeah.
But they deeply, deeply, deeply care about learning. And when I do my classroom observation work and the systematic side of that, it's very rare for a teacher to talk about learning strategies. It's even more rare for them align and teach the teaching strategies as part of the lesson. And we have a whole language that says that if Mike doesn't understand it, we personify the problem as Mike, not as I haven't taught the learning strategies. And then when you look at the Rosenthal principles, the other principles out there, they're seen as almost novel in many schools, whereas they should be the essence and part of it. And when a recent study was done of all the textbooks used in initial teacher education across your country, they looked at about 80 books. At total, they found 5 pages in those 80 books that even mentioned the learning. And I find it fascinating that the first study in psychology, Ebbinghaus, 1856, was on spaced versus mass practice. If you learn something over time, do 10 problems over 10 days, it's a hell of a lot better than doing 10 problems at once. Find me a single book that talks about interleaving, that talks about space practice. Every textbook is written as massed, every class is massed, and we don't even use the most basic principles. So my campaign is your campaign, is how do we get learning as the center? How do we get schools, this is Vivian Robinson, how do you get schools as learning organizations? I think we've made dramatic steps in staff room to make learning organizations. I don't think we've hardly touched the classroom. So my campaign, along with yours in this series, is let's have every teacher have a theory of learning. It's fascinating when you ask teachers for a theory of learning, at best they'll talk about Piaget and maybe Vygotsky, who wasn't the theory of learning at all, but that's another story. And they're 80 years old, and dramatics happened in that time. Cognitive load is a theory some people know about. Very good theory. It's a very powerful part, but it's just that part of it. There's other parts of it too. So our new work is looking at the theory of learning, trying to align it with teachers. As you know, in the sequel, I tried to talk about intentional alignment. So we get that, and part of it's that. So your podcast is right on it. We do need, nothing against the theory of teaching. We need that. But we do need a theory of learning. So I ask all of you, please have a theory of learning, make it contestable, talk about it. Talk about it with your students, talk about it in the staff room. It's what students come to school to do, is to know how to learn. Of course, learning is about something. So that doesn't go away either.
John, I have to tell you that every time I get the opportunity to talk to you, and I know Mike feels the same, I feel like it's just a great learning opportunity, but it's also just genuinely good to see you. So thank you for being on the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Thank you guys. You're always fun to be with.
We just got a lesson from John Hattie.
Yeah, I mean, John is always really interesting to talk to, because I had mentioned, he was talking about going to Sweden and all these trips. And I remember, and I said it during the podcast interview, it really did strike me, because it was the first time I spent so much time with John. And what people don't know is when you're traveling from country to country, it sounds wonderful, and it is, but it's also like we got into Sweden at midnight and had to get up at 5 o'clock the next morning and all of this. But I do remember being in Denmark with him and just sitting, and for me, I was on a leave of absence from being a principal. So this was a whole new world, and sitting in this small room with like 10 people and having them just fire questions at John one after another. And he just so politely answered, and he listened and all that stuff. Those were things that I will always look back on and say, I wish, like, I hope people understand that's the kind of person that he is. He has a thoughtful response. So when he was talking a little bit about, what evidence do you need to prove that you're wrong? He's still very open to that when it comes to some of the criticisms about his own research and his own findings. He wants people to come to him and talk about what if, or, have you thought about this, and those kind of things. So I love that he really kind of shows that part of himself in the podcast too.
And I think that's what resonated with me too, Peter, is that he, before I had the incredible privilege and opportunity to meet John, I thought of John Hattie as John Hattie is John Hattie, with an exclamation point. And, this interview, he was very human. And like you said, he was very open, and the tear of maybe he was wrong. And, the vulnerability that he used as he shared that, and not, like you said, he's not afraid of that, because he wants education and the learning to occur at its very highest level. And if there's something better, so be it. He basically said that. And, he's really the epitome of a lifelong reader and learner, totally.
Yeah. And, it was funny when you asked him about when did he know, and he said he wrote visible learning just because he had to get it out of his system. And look what happened after that. I mean, it's just kind of amazing. So for everybody out there that's looking to write a book and, I just want to get these ideas done on paper, who knows what can happen. But yeah, it's really an honor to talk to him. And it's, quite honestly, it's been kind of great to be in the podcast with you. It's a little bit odd to be sitting next to you during this one, but
absolutely.
But this is the end of the season. It's John Hattie, so that's how we're ending the season. But it's been a great season to interview people and ask them, what they have learned over their trajectory. And it might be interesting for those of you that are listeners to actually consider that. What have you learned over your years of experience as teachers, as leaders, or whatever your position might be within education? And, we love your feedback. We love when we get feedback from people who are listening to the show. So always reach out to us. But as always, thank you for listening to yet another season of Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. And we look forward to being back with you in the next season.
Thanks so much for being here.